Hey, welcome to Wine Talks with Paul Kay, and we are in studio today in beautiful Southern California, about to have a conversation with Dr. Clinton Lee up in Canada. Introductions in just a moment. Wine Talks, of course, available on iHeartRadio, Pandora, Spotify, wherever you hang out for your podcasting. And always sponsored by the original Wine of the Month Club, now supporting the Napa Sonoma and Sweet series of wines. Hey, have a listen to a podcast we just released with Clovis Tétanger. Incredibly philosophical approach to the business of wine, a very large champagne house, well known, but an interesting philosophical, down-to-earth approach to this industry. Have a listen. It's up now on all your favorite podcast hangouts. But we're here to have a conversation with Dr. Clinton Lee. He's got so many acronyms after his name, I'm not sure I can pronounce them all, but Doctor, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Paul.
And what part of Canada are we in right now?
Currently, I'm in the West Coast in the city of Vancouver.
Okay, so
it's
just
a very picturesque city amongst cities in the world.
Is that the background I see? Is that Vancouver?
No, that's Italy, actually.
I see. Right.
My second most favorite country in terms of scenic splendor.
I want to talk about that as well when it comes to wine and sort of that relationship between these travels and the wines that you taste. But I want to read your bio just here real quick, which is on your website, Apwasi. We'll talk about that in a minute. Dr. Clinton Lee has a bachelor's degree in accounting, an MBA in finance, and a doctorate in business administration. He's attained the Wine and Spirit Education Diploma, a certified international educator from London. Dr. Lee has also attained the Certified Specialist of Wine, Certified Specialist of Spirits designation, and the French Wine Scholar. He is certified sherry educator, awarded by the Consejo de Regulador in Spain, and is a wine judge with the Hong Kong International Wine Judging Association, and it goes on. How have you had time to create all these beautiful accolades and experience yourself in the wine industry? This is quite a task.
Well, I think that's most likely because of the rather stern education that I began with, that being of a Jesuit education at a very young age. And that has sort of molded me into appreciating and valuing education. And that in itself has always, I would say, impressed upon me the value of education, and therefore always wanting to learn. So that has molded me into the sort of perennial student, as it were, and writing an exam of one or other sorts annually.
It's not even on my script here, but I want to peel that back a little bit. This idea of education, particularly in our industry, but I sense maybe it's the millennials, maybe it's the generations that are after that, this lack of respect for that. I don't mean that as a derogatory thing. I mean that there's not as much respect for the idea of education and just to learn. Forget the accolades and the acronyms after your name, but just to learn something and understand the value of that thing and the historical value and the history of that. Like, I'm reading a book on the French Revolution because I want to learn about how it got to where it is today, because I'm so fascinated with the French and the French wines. And so we go backwards a little bit and we educate ourselves. Is that something generational, you think?
Yes. I think you're going to enjoy the 1789 Ancien Régime doing your studies there, Paul. That's an excellent question. And it's been part of my research for the book that I'll be completing my manuscript the end of November. It certainly is generational. What has happened is, over the years, more likely in the last 2 decades, we have to acknowledge that the onslaught of technology has changed definitively the landscape of the entire kaleidoscope and facets of our lives. And now, as you mentioned, the generations before, after the Second World War, the boomers, possibly the one generation after, the Generation X, the internet and the smartphones were not as prolific and they were not as omnipresent as they are now. So as a result of that, knowledge used to be focused on individuals who had the amount of time and, to a degree, the enthusiasm for wanting to learn. So they were the sort of centers of influence. But now, in the last 2 decades, you have the smartphone, the iPad, you have access to information that is readily available. It's not now a matter of amassing, concentrating the knowledge that you wish to have. It's a matter of finding it. So you're in between this labyrinth, this maze. So, oh, where do I find this piece of information? And as a result of that, it's the accessibility that has increased to such a degree that it's those that are able to find that treasure of knowledge that makes them so more at the pinnacle, as opposed to those that amass the knowledge themselves. Now it's those who can find it.
That's a really interesting thought. My father passed in June, prolific academian, 5 languages. He jumped into the wine business in 1972 when he bought a wine shop, and a matter of years was lecturing on wine. And as I was packing his books up, and he's donating many of them to the University of Southern California, particularly Armenian heritage books and language books. In fact, I peeled off a couple I was not going to deliver to the school because there are books about the Armenian history and art and architecture, but they're written in French. So I figured I'll just keep those because I learned French because of him, so I could speak with him. To the day he died, we were speaking French with each other. So, but I was carrying these books, these volumes, and this weight, and I kept thinking to myself, the granularity of the information in these books and the history that you can read. You might find it online, but I think our society doesn't allow us to spend the time on our phones to read these, tomes of information. A paragraph of the book I'm reading on the French Revolution would give you more than most articles on the web would tell you about the same subject. And I'm thinking to myself, what's happened to these? What happens to this information? Because it shapes what somebody might do or say in the future if that's not accurate, or that is a decision they base on something that they think is accurate, but the reality of it and the history of it isn't accurate. And here I am lugging these books into my van going, wow, what happened to all this information? And I know he didn't read them all, but there's many of them were earmarked and dog tagged that he had read and tried to understand. And there's something about that, and there's something about trying to educate today's university students to dig past what's on the web and dig past Google and dig past and actually study the subjects. And I think wine's one of those subjects. Is that what brought you to start Apoisi?
So that's a very interesting question, Paul. Thank you. So Apoisi is the acronym for the Asia Pacific Wine and Spirit Institute. And the reason why that institute came into being, the name itself, we're based on the west coast of Canada, and we are part of the Asia Pacific Rim.
Mm-hmm.
My interest in developing the institute itself was sort of an embarkation of having put together all my experiences of studying other institutes and schools of what they were teaching. And they are brilliant. They're absolutely brilliant at what they do. WSET, the Wine Scholar Guild, the Society of Wine Educators. The material that they have there is extremely informative. But what I found that was lacking, and this is no indicator of the quality of the education that they provide, it's just a different perspective. is that of cultural, historical relevance.
Mm.
So, as you are a well-read, and I'm sure you're a person who has
Thank you.
enjoyed many, many glasses of wine, let's just say, let's take Bordeaux as an example. You know, many people would think, oh, Bordeaux, the Grand Crus, you know, the main chateaus, what are the grapes, what are the soils? Absolutely, it is essential. But when you are in front of a consumer, and I'm thinking of someone who's selling the wine, because that was something you had mentioned earlier on. The consumer is walking in and they want to buy a bottle of wine, which you perhaps would suggest a Grand Cru, as this is a very special occasion. You don't have the time to explain,
Mm.
oh, this is the terroir, this is the climate, this was a particular year. They don't have the time. So you have to catch the nuances. You have to be able to share what is the culture, where does it all come from, and that was not forthcoming in these particular educational materials that were offered. So with the Asia Pacific Wine and Spirit Institute, one of our missions is to promote culture and etiquette whenever we're able to, through the knowledge of wine and spirits.
You know that I saw one of your videos where you were teaching how to toast, and I think it was the approach to toasting, which is such a regional and ethnic thing to do. The Armenians say gnats, which is a very formal to life, basically, because Armenians are don't feel like life has given them a fair shake, and this is the way to sort of acknowledge that and look for the future. But it was interesting that you do videos on things like toasting, which are so ethnically driven. Because I always wonder with the Witsets and the masters court of sommeliers and the master of wine. One of the things I want to talk about is that the requirement here in Los Angeles, if you sell wine, particularly wholesale, it's a minimum that you have a Witset 1 or 2 or 3 just to get the job. And so at some point it looks like and it feels like it's just a diluted degree, not picking on anyone in particular, but
Understood.
that if you have to have it just to get a job to sell stuff, and then you find out when the people come here to sell me wine that they really have no interest in understanding the value of the glass of wine or what they're selling, they strictly did it to get the job, it feels to me that some of these credentials get diluted just for the work, when it takes some real passion to understand this. And I think what you're doing is the right approach. Now we get to discover the background of something, the etiquette of something, the ethnicity of something, the what drove those wines to the bottle in the first place, to get a rounded viewpoint of what you're serving as in the hospitality sector. But so do you find like your students that come to learn at Abwasi, what are they looking for?
They're varied. It's like a diamond. You know, there are so many cuts and facets that the students are seeking. Some come along and they are looking for pure knowledge. Others are seeking to improve their professional approach. Others are seeking to climb the ladder. And then there are those that are merely dipping their little toe into the water of the wine world. They are from that of the professional. We've had university professors that have taken our courses, to wine professionals, to enthusiasts. The difference that they have found is the cultural aspect. You know, you mentioned with pride your Armenian background, and not many people know that Yerevan, which is the capital of Armenia, at sunset there's a beautiful and spectacular pink setting and color that casts across the city. And that's because of the materials that were used, a sort of pinkish limestone, which they used to build the edifices of the spectacular city itself. And if someone was to give me a bottle of Armenian wine to sell, I would say that would be one of the first things that I would mention. Of course, there would be the aspect of the grape itself, but the taste. But in essence, when you're holding up that bottle, because they're quite rare to come by, you are holding the spirit of the people, the spirit, the historical significance and witnessing of that vintage, what they went through. And that has a unique richness, which unfortunately, when many people go to wine stores, they are greeted with a mediocre at most times, and I'm not saying all, but there is a sense of mediocrity. Oh, what are you having for dinner? I'm going to have a steak. Oh, well, I'd recommend a full-bodied wine. Here's a Cabernet Sauvignon for you. There's a sense of wanting to go back to the classics as opposed to encouraging people to test the length, the breadth, and the span of different wines, and in essence, exposing the different cultures. So with our students, we always encourage them. You are enjoying a glass of wine, but that glass of wine has so much more than just the pure enjoyment of enjoying it with friends.
That is very profound. You're very articulate this morning, just so you know. And I feel like I'm not as articulate as I can be, but you're really explaining and laying out the land because, well, actually, a young Armenian, I'll say it again, a young Armenian winemaker told me this, and I've used it many times, and it's a fascinating concept. And it seems like wine, or maybe there's another product you can come up with, but it is a product that you can bring halfway across the world, put on a desk, and say, this is who we are, and this is when we were, because it's dated, and it means something every time we go to harvest, and that's why there's a celebration of the harvest in virtually every ethnicity and country in the world, because it's celebrating this moment in time. And then we get to display who we were and what we were at the time. And I've used that many times because I think it's a fascinating concept. And so I agree with you completely. And I have this discussion with people all the time, in particular winemakers, and we're wrestling in this industry between the shelf items at most markets that don't have a hand sell opportunity for somebody to try something new, and the stuff that everybody wants to buy because it's slightly sugared and it's easy to drink and it's a go-to wine. And the idea, I think, from the business standpoint of wine, you just mentioned it, we're not going to be talking about, we don't have enough time. We have too many tables to wait on. We don't have time to discuss the idea of Chateauneuf de Pape and the difference between that and the Bordeaux based on what you're eating. We're just going to go with what you want. And I think that, again, to use the word dilute, I think it dilutes, the things we have to offer in this industry to a human experience, to experience the humanity of wine, really what it is. And because the business of wine gets in the way. I was at the store the other day with my social networker, and I told the story earlier. I'll make it brief, but a woman came up while we were shooting a TikTok video, which is trying to get kicked out of the market, but no one ever wants to kick me out for shooting a video. And I said, well, can I help you find a wine? She says, I want to buy something other than what I usually drink.
Good question.
And I said, what do you usually drink? She says, J. Lohr. So great, classic chain item wine. And so she looked around. I pointed a couple things out. She didn't buy either one of the ones I pointed out, and she left. And I told my employee, I said, you just witnessed two very important aspects of our industry. One is that she actually was looking for something different, which is great. We want that to happen. But two, it's such an emotional product that she wouldn't even take the recommendation, and I'd already given her my card, of somebody in the industry based on what she's looking for, because you still look at the label and look at the price, and you try to make a decision and you try to move on. So in your organization, when the students come to learn, we're focusing more on the ethereal value of the glass and in tying it to history and tying it to some kind of ethnicity or cultural value. Is that accurate?
Partially. I think it's imperative that for the students who are undertaking any of the courses, they have to realize there's the harsh gladiatorial exercise of business, and that is selling the bottle of wine.
Mm-hmm.
The courses themselves are not courses specifically on how to sell a bottle of wine. They give you the components and the brick and mortar, as it were, to build the wall of being able to have that platform in order to sell. Now, talking about that particular example that you had, you had your J. Law. It's a highly respected wine. It's, in most likelihood, it was a Cabernet Sauvignon,
Mm-hmm.
and there was that lovely vanilla aroma from, the oak that they put the wine into. And if that was her particular style, it's certainly here in Canada, it's not an inexpensive bottle of wine. So that automatically would lend itself, as we would put it in our practical sessions, of saying, okay, well, this is what you're having. Have you ever thought of, it's on the same latitude, somewhere similar in other parts of the world? Would you like to try, let's just say, something Italian, like perhaps an Amarone or a Barolo or something quite different. And I do apologize for that.
No worries.
Right. Sort of getting back to my thoughts there. In terms of that J-Law, you'd want to allow them to find different paths, different discovery archers, as it were. That's what I call them, archers. So right now, it's a New World American. Well, why don't you try an Old World wine? There's some magnificent wines that you might try. There's Portugal, there's Spain. They also have these rather big and also bold wines, like a Touriga Nacional or a Rioja. But it's not a matter of experiencing and putting out names. It's explaining to them, oh, well, Touriga Nacional, that's what they use to make port. So it has that essence. And have you heard about port? And they might say, oh, well, no, not really. Sorry, Paul.
No worries. What's that music? Do I hear something? Do you hear something? Yeah.
All right. Sorry about that, Paul.
Yeah, no problem.
I had the phone ringing.
So that's why I have editing features.
That's right. Yeah. That's when we're interviewing, we do the same thing.
Right.
So would you like to just sort of pick up at the last bit, about the J-Law and then let's pick up from there.
Sure. I mentioned this story about her. I said, so
helping the lady. You said,
yeah.
Here's,
So I told
two very good lessons.
I told my social network employee. I said, you witnessed two very, very important lessons in our industry and what we need to not only sell but to have the consumer understand is that wine is a very emotional product. So even if somebody recommends something in the aisle of a grocery store that's in the industry, the consumer still is intimidated by what they see.
Of course, of course, certainly, because there's a plethora of choices. Number one, they're not sure which wine they will select and how will it taste. The second aspect is the pricing. I mean, this is the prime aspect. The majority of purchasers, price is a huge indicator of the wine that they will select, unless, of course, it is for a special occasion, a birthday, an anniversary, a celebration. Otherwise, your normal everyday drinking, they would like something that they are familiar with, and it's not the time to explore.
Do you think that's a what's the word I'm looking for? Problem isn't a big enough word. Sort of the curse of our industry with this formula-based wines like the Apothic Reds of the world and the J. Lours and the not the J. Lours as much, but the Joshes and the 19 Crimes that are clearly formula-driven, made to taste and have a profile like whiskey might every year. It's got to be the same, or a beer, and that well, it's a very comfortable thing to do is buy, and I get so disappointed when I grab something that either wasn't curated properly by the wine shop or the store, or it's been on the shelf too long and it just deteriorated on its own. I mean, is that sort of the comfort zone that the consumer's into? Is like, yeah, just it's 14% alcohol. This is a pretty easy decision to make.
Many buyers, in fact, most buyers around the world would like to have a sense of guarantee of the quality of the wine that they're going to drink. They may have heard murmurings and whispers in the avenues and halls of the wine gods to say, well, this wine might be off. You might have issues with it. You might not even like this wine. So those that are not as adventurous, there's the sense that when these particular wines that you have mentioned and others like them, their one selling proposition is that there's consistency. The consumer knows what they're going to be receiving. They are quite familiar with the pricing, which will not fluctuate wildly, as opposed to being adventurous and taking not one or two, but 3 steps or more, and furthering their horizon and their palate and their cultural borders to envelop what sits in that particular glass. So in that sense, you're absolutely correct. And I think it is left to staff that you have, individuals like yourself through this program, and a multitude of other importers and retailers across the world, across the globe, crossing cultures, who are now going to share this seismic shift. I was interviewing a certain gentleman, Mr. Jeffett, Andrew Jeffett, and he was telling me, and I agree with him, that what happens is we have been so much sort of like Pavlov's, the exercise with Pavlov and the ringing of the bell.
Pavlov's dog, right? Classical conditioning.
Yeah. Where there should be one good wine. So if you have a flight, we often ask, which is the best wine? Or you've been asked, as I have, what's the best wine you've had, Paul? As opposed to, could you give me the 3 most interesting wines that you've tasted? Because if you are having one particular wine that you are saying is the best out of a flight of 5, being humans that we are, we would find fault. in the other four as to why
Mm-hmm.
they're not the best.
That's right.
So rather
Totally right.
than expanding and broadening the base, we are bringing the focus to one only. And therein, I believe, lies the problem.
Well, I was reading an article yesterday or the day before about our industry. Look, for the consumer, they know, and my listeners already know, this is business, right? So there's margins to be had, and how much different would the wine business be if sales wasn't an issue?
Of
If we
course.
were just set out to produce the best we could produce based on what was given to us by the vineyard and the land that year. And so it's a different ballgame once you do that. And so there's been a lot of consolidation of wholesalers. Um, Even here in Southern California, this one wonderful company called Epic Wines closed. It was bought by RNDC, one of the big wholesalers. And not only did that, the ripple effect of not having, if you're a winery and you were in the book of Epic, have the attention you used to have because it was a smaller distributor and they were hand
Mm-hmm.
sold wines. Now is with a big distributor and that you're not even seen. But all the people, all the little distributors and wholesalers and importers that use the same warehouse that Epic used, and Epic was the main customer when they moved, it closed the warehouse, and I had wonderful Italian vendors and French vendors coming to me looking for space to put their wines because they lost access to the marketplace because they couldn't distribute the wines anymore. And so we have to keep in mind it's business, right? But inside of that, we have the requirement to educate the consumers on the value of that glass of wine you're talking about. And that's a task that we can't take lightly. And I really respect what you're doing at Apoissy to let that happen. You mentioned something earlier. Let's define new world and old world. We were talking about North America. Do you consider it a place or a style or a combination?
Well, classically, when we mention the word New World and Old World, New World relates to countries outside of Europe. So Old World are essentially Europe and the major players. So Italy, France, Spain, Portugal, Germany. Those in essence are defined as the Old World, and other up and coming wine producing countries. Your New World are countries that are outside of Europe, and as a result, the flexibility they have when it comes to producing wine is far greater than the severe limitations that the Old World has imposed. Australia would be a clear example of the wines that they produce and the innovations that they have come up with, which are now used in many of the New World production. I often like to compare New and Old World whenever I'm giving a master class or whenever I'm sharing with friends and colleagues, because there's always this question, what is the difference? And the only way that you will be able to have that discerning taste is to taste it yourself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And once you've tasted more than one or two or even up to 10 different wines, your palate starts to develop its own sense of what you like, what you don't like. And if there is something I'd like to share with our listeners, there's a difference between identifying what is different. So you may have a wine, you don't like it, but it's a good wine. So it has balance, it has the fruit concentration, it has a good level of acidity or tannins, whatever the case might be. However, you don't like it. And I think if you can be very objective about this, then your wine knowledge and perception will go leaps and bounds as opposed to the singular step that you take. If you only say, I like this wine because I personally, subjectively like it, then you are closing the gates to other lovely wines, which you may develop a palate for later. I'm sure you've had that, Paul.
Mm-hmm. Well, our palates change regularly.
They change like life itself.
In fact, my wife's changed so frequently that I take 2 bottles of wine every time we go somewhere because I'm not sure she's going to feel like a Bordeaux style wine or something from some other part of the world that she's enjoyed before. But I can't tell you how many times, even the second night, I'll open the same bottle and 2 or 3 nights later, and she'll turn her nose up at it. I'm like, you just had it 2 days ago and you really liked it. And so our palates change not only, over time, they change rather radically. But you said something important, and I want to peel that back a little bit. The idea that it's a good wine, but you may not like it, and that sort of is the definition of and the scourge of the point system. Because I always talk about, my friends who have this cellars full of Napa cabs, and they're all rated 95, 96, or whatever. And I could bring a 95-point Barolo or a 95-point Listran Negro from the Canary Islands or something, and they won't like it. And so if you're a point buyer, you're going to find that same thing. But I suppose at least you also know that that's a great example of what it's supposed to be.
This is the question that has been at top of mind for quite some time now. What is the usefulness of points? And who determines and who defines those points? So,
hang on, folks, you're about to hear it.
so one must bear in mind, if you're going to go and have a meal, bear in mind your background, the food that you grew up in, the food that you ate, where you grew up, how you were influenced by the people, the food, the terrain. That's your palate. And your palate, I mean, look at the two of us. We have a different upbringing. We grew up in different countries. The food that is comfort for you may be the horror of horrors for me. And yet, I am expecting an individual who certainly by no means is close to the type of upbringing that 1, 10, 20 people have had, and yet they are saying this is a good wine. So coming back to the good wine, again, you have to be the people who are giving the points system, you have to ensure they're objective. When they pick up that wine, on what basis are they making that numerical setting?
Mm-hmm.
Are they not influenced? That's the first thing. Are they being paid directly or indirectly by the wine that they are reviewing? The second question would be, on what basis are they reviewing that wine? Is it an objective basis to say quality of balance, length, tannin, acidity, which I think many professionals in our industry would accept are fair judgmental criteria?
Mm-hmm.
And the third aspect is, how many wines are you tasting? Now, you and I know that after tasting 8 or 10 wines within a fairly long period, 2 hours or perhaps 1.5 hours, maybe even an hour, your tongue does experience fatigue.
Mm-hmm.
So where you have individuals who state, we've tasted over 25,000 wines in this year, well, you only have to do your own calculations based on an 8-hour day.
Mm-hmm.
How many wines have tasted?
Yeah.
And very recently, there have been some very well-known individuals who've mentioned that certain wines may have also been influenced by their interest in getting certain points. And I think that's that's fairly well written and evidenced by some of the articles out there. So I think for the consumer, does it have its place? Yes, it does, because they're uninitiated. They don't know much. And that's why I think that if the importer, the educators, the frontline gladiators at the retail store share very quick, brief gems into this treasure of wine and say, why don't you try this? And give them the basics. Let them be the decider of which wines they would like. This will not evolve within a month, a year. It may take up to several years, but there will be a change. And I think with the ever-present and increasing wine apps and the ability to source knowledge at the mere touch of your finger, it will become easier for the new generation. And that's who really we ought to be laying the foundation for. Change is inevitable, Paul.
If they just stay off of Vivino, I'd be happy, because everybody uses Vivino to decide something, and it's not even right, what because the AI goes out and finds the ratings in the places where it can be things. And it's like I stopped using Yelp food app, the food portion of Yelp, and some of the other Foursquare. I stopped using it because you just said it. The experience of this person who's making that rating is completely different than mine. And what they might consider incredible food, is horrid in my side. So I started relying on apps that it's the same review easy for you to say, same reviewer, like the Michelin Guide, because it's inside the group, and so they have this benchmark to work with. And it's funny because I have a lot of customers that complain to me, not a lot, but some customers complain to me that, hey, you gave this wine a 95 or a 97 or 98, and all my wines I sell have those ratings from me, because the way I look at it, it's not against all the 98-point wines that the Spectator does amongst its peers, amongst the other $20 Cabernets, amongst the other $15 Chardonnays, amongst whatever. Mm-hmm. We've tasted enough here to say, okay, this is the better value of those wines. So my 98 doesn't mean you can stack it up against a Chateau Margaux or something. It just means that you, amongst its other wines of the same shelf item, in other words, you took me to the market and there was $25, $40 Cabernets, I could tell you which one's worth $5 and which one's worth $50. And so they get confused by the point system. Do you think that's different? I had a conversation with Bartholomew Broadbent and his father Michael and the Harry Waz of the world back in the day. They didn't use systems like this. Do you think that's a different criteria? You think there's a different approach to rating wines when in that generation?
I think that statement will echo in the halls of history. In those days, they'd have the rotor type of phone. That's how many in those times would use. Whereas now we walk around with a phone in our back pocket or the inside of our jacket, and it doesn't matter which part of the world we're in. As long as there's connectivity, mm-hmm. we can speak to someone. I mean, here, take this interview as an example. We're thousands of miles apart, yet I can see you clear as day, and I can hear you, so crystal clear. That's technology. So yes, the generations before, there was a time, there's a place, and that transformed into the time of the Robert Parkers and the 100 pointers. And then you now have a plethora of other points coming in, and the estimations of them. But I think this new generation, and I applaud them in their own way, the questions that they are asking is not so much how many or what is the points that this wine has managed to garner. It's more, well, how sustainable is this wine? What is the carbon footprint of transporting this wine from halfway across the world? How are the labor practices of this particular vineyard?
Mm-hmm.
These are more of the pertinent questions of this generation. And it is the, immemorial cycle of life that with each generation comes change. And with that change, the generation preceding may find it somewhat hard to accept. And we have to, because it is change. I mean, if you 20 years ago, you say you could buy a bottle of wine by ordering it on the internet, people would laugh at you.
Yeah.
And yet, that's happening.
That's what
People would, and we have to realize that. But I think what doesn't change is the aspect of culture. I mean, you look at yourself. I'm sorry for your loss, yet you carry with you every breath, every footstep, every sense of celebration and pride you have that your father instilled in you. And he would probably say, well, this is what the old country was about. This is what, when you take that step towards another Armenian and you speak to them, and you are going to pass that to the next generation. And that's what we call tradition. Mm-hmm. So that tradition, the mannerisms and the etiquette, that I think is timeless. It's matchless. It cannot be surpassed because it is part of our makeup as individuals, as a society. And the wine that we drink is indicative of that. And that is what Apoasi is doing. We are bringing that to the fore, as opposed to mere statistics, mere designations. Italy, yes, you have the DOC, DOCG, IGT, you have your different classifications. Wine is not just that. Those are the rules of the road. But it's enjoying that journey. And that's what people like you are doing every single day when you meet people.
There's something more to the hand. When I shake somebody's hand, boy, they sure get a mouthful because we try to make sure. But what you're saying is prolific, and I call part of it the ethereal value of a real glass of wine. There's the experiential value, which is I'm sitting in front of the Parthenon and I'm having a glass of Trattoria-based red wine, but it's the best thing I've ever tasted.
Yes.
Even though amongst its peers, it's probably not the greatest thing that they pour. But this ethereal value of a glass of wine, it has endured centuries, if not more. There was a book I was reading on the medieval part of wine, and from BC, 100 years, 300, 400 years BC, sure. These wines they're finding. And so there's something about the fermented grape that connects us to the soil, that's to the roots, to whatever humanity has to do with its environment. Wine seems to be the only product that's endured all this. And I have this belief that that's what's going to endure through the millennials, through the Generation Zs and Xs, that eventually they stop drinking White Claw because they realize it's just flavored junk. And that there's something very ethereal and very relaxing and very emotional and sensory overload to a good glass of wine. And you mentioned this earlier about tasting wines and you get tongue fatigue. I taste on Tuesdays. I'll taste tomorrow. Well, tomorrow I'm not tasting, but I usually get through 50 or 60 wines in about 6-7 hours. And it's true. You do get fatigued. And I rely heavily on my sense of smell to get through that, which is probably one of the most memorable senses that you have. And so it's this whole sensory evaluation that you're giving a glass of wine, not just what you're tasting all the time. I told this story to somebody the other day. My wife and I went to Paris not too long ago, and we were sitting at a tourist brasserie overlooking the Eiffel Tower, mm-hmm. and I ordered the quiche, and they put it in front of me, and I paused for a good 30 seconds. And my wife's like, "What's wrong with you?" I said, "The smell of this quiche takes me back to when I was probably 8 or 9 years old. My mom made the same quiche, and it was a throwback." And I thought to myself, how important is that in the wine world? that we smell a wine months, years later, maybe in a different vintage of the same place, and you gotta go, wow, I remember this. And there's a value to that, in my opinion. It's the cultural value you're bringing up. It's the ethereal value of the glass that I think eventually, despite the peaks and valleys of our industry and what's happening in the formula-based wines, will always endure. I think it'll always be part of our life, and has for centuries already. I can't believe we're already at 48 minutes.
Sure.
We haven't touched
That's fine.
touched on all the subjects, but what is next for Apoissy? What do you want to get next on the thing? I'm wondering, like, for instance, we already mentioned Armenia, but there's Georgian wines are coming to the market. I had an interview with a Lithuanian wine influencer. The food and wine culture of Lithuania now becoming European. God, there was a horrible story on Facebook, on LinkedIn yesterday about a Som in Ukraine that was buried in a bomb blast.
Yes.
But what's Apoissy looking to do in the future?
We have allow me a moment, because
Sure.
this is it's something quite magnificent that our team has spent an enormous amount of time. And on our team, we have a large proportion of them are of the younger generation, which I think is vital for any organization, community, or country. You have to understand, because they are going to be leading the way in terms of how the perception of life is going to be. So at Apoissy, we've set our foundation through our innumerable courses. We have about 27 online wine courses, not just wine, but also spirits and also luxury goods. And one is able to take courses at their own pace and at their leisure. But one of the aspects that I find, and I've been very fortunate, Paul, I've traveled to over 100 countries and multitudes of cities, cities you might not even think of or heard of. And through them, I've gained enormous experience and respect for the different cultures of the peoples. And it is through the food, the wine, and the mere time that you spend walking through those cobbled streets, or the newly paved marble sidewalks, or that you'll see in the different cities. But it is that experience that you really reinforce and signifies how important people and other cultures are. So starting in 2023, Apoissy is going to be introducing, and you'll see on our social media, there will be wine and culture tours that will be led by me.
Wow.
And there's only going to be 22 places for each tour that we have. So there'll be visits to Hungary, visits to Italy, the Amalfi Coast, Sorrento, Capri, taking them through Pompeii, and this, the area of Vesuvius. And we have other wine tours going through in Port, Portugal, and then Sherry. So now they can study the course, they can travel, and the other aspect is we would like to be working with people like yourself and other gladiators in the arena of the global wine industry, so that these intrepid travelers and adventurers of wine, if they like a particular wine, they can order it. And it's there for them, literally at the click of their fingers. So now they've imbibed all this knowledge that we've created, they've experienced the tour, and they can taste it, the experience, the palate experience. So that's one of the areas that we
That's
are
great.
expanding into immediately. The other one that we have been working on for quite some time, and this is one of the inequalities that I believe is quite prevalent in the wine industry. If you ask most wine importers, name me six wine producing countries, they would have no problem with that. Let's say France, Italy, Spain, Portugal, United States, Australia.
Mm-hmm.
Could be any of those or others. But ask them to name wine producing countries from Eastern Europe.
Mm-hmm.
As you mentioned,
Much
Lithuania, as you mentioned, Georgia, all right? And because the current educational system does not have those countries within their curriculum, as for example, China, India, right? They don't have those curriculum within their studies. So future importers don't know about them, so they don't ask for them. The wine producers in those countries don't have an avenue of sending their wine products to countries because the major players have never heard of them. And if they've never heard of them, you yourself, unless through your private studies, would not recommend any of those bottles because
Mm-hmm.
A, you don't have them in your store, and B, you've never heard of them. So it is one of our missions, and we have our team now starting to develop and look at courses all about those lesser known wine producing countries. As you mentioned, there's Romania, there's Lithuania, there's Georgia, which is the embryonic seed, as it were, of the Vitis vinifera, and where
Mm-hmm.
it's
Mm-hmm.
acknowledged that's where wine began,
Mm-hmm.
certainly in the European sphere. And we're very proud. We produced the world's first Wines of China course earlier on this year. So at least when people think of China, they don't think of wine. And during my visits there for research, one of the questions that I asked them was, what are the major problems that you're facing? And I would have thought winemakers or technology. It wasn't winemakers. Most of their winemakers are trained in France,
Mm-hmm.
highly qualified, and you'd have no problem communicating with them, Paul, because they all speak French.
Perfect. Parfait.
And it's not land, it's actually people. They
That's
don't
it.
have enough people to work in the vineyard.
I
And I
know that.
found that bizarre. I said, how
Why?
so?
We're having trouble here. What?
Yeah. And I thought, China being the most populous country in the world, and the logic behind that is because of the change in economic opportunities. Droves of people have moved from the countryside to the cities, and as a result of that, there's not enough people. So that is a major impediment.
Mm-hmm.
So these are the areas. Number one, our really exciting, incisive, cultural, wine, and etiquette travel tours to different parts of the world, not only the northern, but also the southern hemisphere. So we'll be having them in April and May, and also in September and October. So those will be seen on our social media, and we'll be opening up the places for them. And the second will be working with wine producers and the people who are very knowledgeable in those specific countries, and working with them to produce wine courses that will be available for those who have an interest online.
very both of those noble and humbling things to progress in our industry. And if you need help with experts in the industry of particularly Armenian wines or Georgian wines, I have very good connections here in Los Angeles of guys that only do those wines. And I think it's a fascinating approach. We were in Croatia not that long ago, and I'm like, I had to talk about humility. I didn't recognize one grape, except for Mike Gergich's, wines, of course, the favorite son. But I'm like, I relied heavily on the Psalms at the restaurants, particularly the Michelin-starred restaurants, because I had no idea what I was tasting.
Of course.
And I rarely see Croatian wines here. I do see Georgian wines, and of course Armenian wines, and pretty much that's it on the Eastern European. Hungary, of course, was more popular actually in the '90s in Los Angeles than I've seen lately. What's interesting here, and when I taste on Tuesdays, it's sort of this temperature gauge of what's going on in the industry. It's the business side of things that gets in the way of us experiencing all these wonderful places to have wine, because what's selling is more important than what we're tasting. So it ebbs and flows. Like Australia is sort of on the way back, but they've been gone for a long time because of the dollar value, and it just changes with the marketplace. But we're already on an hour, so I want to wrap this up. But I did want to say something that's interesting to me. What's old is new again. I'm bringing back Les Amis de Vin because I want the consumer to, as an enthusiast of wine and somebody that wants to learn more about the Academia of Wine and to experience the tastings you're talking about and pairings, that we bring these organizations back. But by you doing this tours, now particularly to some more unique countries, I encourage you to review this story about a woman named Joanne Dupuis. She's probably 95 now. She was in Chateau Lescombe when Jim Barrett heard the news that he had won the Judgment of Paris.
Right.
And she was sitting between Alexis Lichine and Andrei Telechev at a luncheon. I mean, imagine this. And the reason how she got there was exactly what you're doing. She was in Napa in the 40s, and somewhere in the 60s she was divorced, and she found herself with no vacation. She started, I love wine, I love tennis, I'm going to start touring the world for wine and tennis. In this case, she had hired Andrei Telechev to come on board, happened to coincide with the Judgment of Paris, and history was born. And I hope that happens to you. I hope that you're somewhere, someplace, somehow, that something breaks loose of one of these wonderful countries that makes wine, and there's a story to tell for both your guests and Apuasi and your own career. And just to make you jealous, Saturday and Sunday I'm on a 2-day tasting of the Quinta Noval Nacional vintages. I think we're going back to the late 1800s, and some of the bottles we're opening will be the last bottles known to exist. And I was very, even though it cost a lot of money, I was very humbled to be invited of the small group of people that get to experience this. I don't know if the gentleman's name was Don Schliff. He used to run Wine Warehouse in Southern California. He became a port collector in the 60s and all through now, and is considered one of the great port collections of the world. And he's slowly just pouring them off so people get a chance to experience them. I'm going to forward your information to him, because if you're in town one of these days, and he does it every year, open some amazing vintages to do. Okay, we're going to wrap this up. And I'm going to ask you a question. I think we talked about this a little bit, but this is the book, Wine is My Best Medicine. It's the Best Medicine. Dr. E.A. Murray, French MD from the 70s, as well as a homeopathic doctor. And he's got a bunch of maladies here, human maladies, and a particular wine, French wine, that might help alleviate the symptoms, if not cure the thing. And so I'm going to give you a malady.
One would be drink copious amounts.
Well, he does. There are a couple of explanations here where he says, "I'm not sure what it does, but you feel better anyway." So
certainly,
let's run with hypertension. You could have a glass of. Well, I'm not going to class because there's a dosage to all these, and we'll talk about that later.
Sure.
A dry champagne, a Saint-Emilion, or a Pouilly-Fuissé or Alsatian white.
A champagne, or a Puy Fusé. Is that right?
Puy
Sorry.
Fumé or an Alsatian white of some
Puy
sort,
Fumé wine.
or Saint-Emilion red.
Saint-Emilion. Well, and the ailment is
Hypertension.
hypertension. Well, I think if I'm feeling hypertension, I'd want to quickly wind down, and the quickest way to do that, and from my understanding, I think I would choose the champagne, because the bubbles would quickly disseminate the alcohol into my bloodstream.
Well, now, much like the Master of Wine test, the justification is as important as the answer, even if the answer is wrong, which in this case it is.
Okay.
Dry champagne would be for fever in this case, and the dosage for fever of dry champagne is a bottle a day, so that's not bad. But the answer was the Puy Fumé or the Alsatian white, and it has something to do with the minerality of those wines that help, I guess, bring down your blood pressure. But then the question is, what's the dosage of a Puy Fumé or an Alsatian white? I also include Sancerre here to help with that. Well, I'll give you the answer. It's 4 glasses a
Four
day.
glasses a day. Okay.
So I guess it'd be 2 at breakfast, 2, 1 at lunch, I don't know, whatever. Anyway, I got a big kick out of this.
Yes, yes. Well, thank you for asking the question.
It's been a huge honor and pleasure to have you on the show, Doctor, and I hope we get to do it again.
Well, Paul, thank you very much for your very incisive questions, which I found to be quite illuminating as the character that you are. And I am absolutely envious of the fact that you're going to be enjoying those delicious, delicious ports. So please, on my behalf, enjoy them to the fullest. And
Thank you.
And I don't think it could have happened to a more honorable person. So well done.
I appreciate that. It does warrant a black tie. I think it's going black tie.
And I think you look splendid in a black tie.
I appreciate the time. I hope you get to Los Angeles to look us up. Likewise, when we're up north.
Please, it would be my pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Paul.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.